03. The young lady renovates the prison. In the gaudy banquet hall, Elliott and his hangers-on were enjoying yet another loud toast as they ignored all the people around them speaking in hushed voices. "Ha ha 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 ha! Oh, this is delightful," Elliott exclaimed. Margaret congratulated him. "You've finally done it, Your Highness." "Yes, finally, I brought that horrible woman to account for her crimes. Margaret, I thank you for your help." "Oh no, I didn't do anything." The people watching all hooted. The mood had turned romantic, and Elliott and Margaret no longer cared who saw them. Their faces drew closer together, and then, "Your Highness!" A well-built young man raced into the hall. "Sykes, you have the worst timing," Elliott scoffed, glaring at the commander of the Knight's Son. Sykes grabbed Elliott's arm. "We have an emergency. Please, come at once." "Hey, what is this about?" Panicking, Sykes began to drag Elliott away. He pulled the prince through the crowd, looking a bit like a jilted ex abducting the bride in the middle of her wedding. Before he could chastise Sykes for this indignity, Elliott needed to calm him down, or he was going to get hurt. He slapped the hand Sykes was using to grip his arm and yelled, "Hey, stop pulling. Your grip is too tight, and it hurts." "Oh, sorry." Sykes hurriedly let go. Elliott thought he could finally ask what was the matter, but Sykes wasn't giving up. "Now please, come this way," he cried. "Huh? Hey, stop it." Sykes scooped Elliott up in his arms, carrying him like a princess, and ran off at a speed that would put a horse to shame. The people left behind began whispering immediately. "Sykes just took Prince Elliott? What does that mean?" Margaret asked, cocking her head. "Oh goodness, does this mean his true love is Lord Abigail?" "No, from the way things were just now." "Wait, is our haughty prince the bottom?" "We'll have to let everyone who couldn't make it here today know." The young ladies watching from a distance continued to spread important information that could affect Elliott's position. By the time Sykes found Elliott and pulled him off to the dungeon using methods he never should have performed in public, the situation had progressed, which is to say, it had gotten even worse. "For goodness sake, what has Rachel done this? What?" Elliott, who had been grumbling the whole way, was dumbstruck. Sykes had thought he was prepared, but even he was speechless at what he saw now. It was far beyond anything he'd imagined. The prison had completely transformed in a mere 30 minutes. The dungeon was a large, square room divided in two by iron bars. In front of the bars was a room for the prison guards to stand by and monitor, and at one end of the wall, there was a staircase made out of the same stone as the rest of the room. The only furniture was a simple table and chair. There was no need for more because interrogations were carried out at the Royal Guard's office. Likewise, palace servants brought the inmates' meals from the kitchens, so there was no cooking equipment either. Behind the bars was the back room, which was what everyone called the dungeon. This was where the prisoners were kept. The interior consisted of stone walls, a stone floor, and a stone ceiling, the same as the front room. There was a toilet and shower in the corner, as well as a sink. The iron bars were the only thing separating the back room from the front room, so essentially it was one big room. Being a dungeon, it was largely underground. Only a number of long, thin windows high up on the wall let in light and fresh air. They were designed to look like vents that went under the floor when viewed from outside, and they were, of course, barred. They were the only source of light in the room, so without a lamp or candle, the dungeon was gloomy even in the middle of the day. Quality of life in this dreary place depended on the position of the person detained and on the magnanimity of whoever put them in here. If the prisoner needed special consideration, or if the person who jailed them was feeling merciful, they could lead a reasonably civilized life here. They might receive furniture and carpets, tables and chairs, and a divider to go around the toilet and shower so that no one could see them. If they were meant to suffer, or if the person in charge was cruel by nature, the prisoner would receive none of those things. They would huddle on the bare stone, shivering in the cold and eating food off trays left on the floor. Every time they defecated or bathed, they would be in full sight of the guard. These conditions would make most people shudder, even more so if they were to be imprisoned here. Yet most of this was nothing more than urban legend. These days, it was almost unthinkable to use the dungeon at all. The treatment of prisoners had become much more humane, and those who were due some consideration were instead locked in inescapable guest rooms where they were kept under close surveillance. As for petty criminals, there was no need to imprison them in the royal palace in the first place. There was a perfectly good prison on the outskirts of the city. They could go there along with the commoners. This dungeon had been built a long, long time ago, when treason and conspiracies were a fact of life, in order to torment those of influence who'd fallen from power. Now, after such a long time of peace, only nobles or courtiers would be imprisoned here, and only the ones who were to be treated worse than ordinary prisoners, making the existence of this place rather contradictory. Rachel Ferguson was just the sort of person who fit those conditions. She was the daughter of a duke, but having incurred the prince's wrath, she was expected to suffer horribly. There just weren't people like that these days. She was a rare specimen. As for whether Prince Elliott had thought that deeply about it, he did not. He just wanted to stick Rachel in an awful place and bully her for picking on his darling Margaret. It never occurred to him what the living situation in here might be like. The prince had only thought that if he imprisoned Rachel in a way that was humiliating for any noble, she would kowtow before Margaret and beg for forgiveness, and he wouldn't be unwilling to grant it. That was as far as his thoughts had gone. In fact, while he was flirting with Margaret after expelling Rachel from polite society, Elliott had forgotten all about such trivial details until Sykes dragged him here. That was why he had no idea why his friend had insisted that he come look at that terrible woman. But when Prince Elliott arrived at the prison, he couldn't comprehend the scene unfolding in front of him. Inside the dungeon, the Duke's daughter was relaxing on the floor. She should have been sitting on stone tile, but instead she sat on a throw rug with geometrical designs on it. The formerly exposed toilet and shower area now had a flowery curtain hanging around it. On top of the throw rug was a comfy, cushioned sofa that could have dragged even a sage down into a life of sloth. She moved to it and lay there reading a book. Of course, next to her was a light bright enough to read by. The inmate who had just arrived today had already changed out of her evening dress and into something more simple and casual. She had been thrown in there with only what she was wearing at the time. So how had she been able to change? Where did she get the furniture? It was impossible. Everything about this scene was impossible. On the other side of those bars was the dungeon. It had to be. Yet the bare stone walls now held a comfortable living space. As all who were present stared speechless at this incomprehensible scene, the young lady appeared to notice something and sat up. Rachel resolutely ignored everyone on the other side of the bars as she lifted the kettle from atop her alcohol lamp and poured the boiling water into a teapot. The scent of black tea seemed out of place, wafting through a dreary jail cell. Rachel smiled in satisfaction as she took a whiff. Elliott's jaw dropped even further at the absurdity of a tea set inside the prison. Sykes and the prison guard looked at each other, but not a word was spoken. At least 5 seconds passed before the prince snapped back to his senses and grabbed the iron bars. "You! Where did you get that?" "I provided it for myself. It puts no strain on the treasury," Rachel replied curtly. "That's not the problem. These are my personal effects. You have no right to complain about them." "I said that's not the problem," the prince repeated, even louder this time. He ground his teeth, angry that they were just talking at each other. Where did you get all of that stuff in there?" Rachel looked around, as if there were something missing, then opened one of the wooden boxes and took out some tea biscuits. It was one of the wooden boxes that were supposedly no longer needed. Yes, they were the very same boxes that had been there before Rachel was thrown in. "That's how she did it?" Sykes shouted. "What?" Elliott barked. The prison guard explained what had happened to the confused prince. Now that Elliott knew how the trick had worked, he started to get dizzy as he watched his ex-fiancée happily nibble on cookies and sip black tea. You're telling me she saw this coming and brought her family's siege supplies in here?" The prince muttered to himself, shocked. "My people brought them here for me, to be precise," Rachel replied, unconcerned. "Well, as you can see, I was prepared for this eventuality." Ignoring the speechless prince, Rachel opened her book to the place she had bookmarked and resumed reading. Everyone recognized Rachel Ferguson's beauty, yet she had a strange lack of presence, to the point where people would forget she was attending a reception alongside the prince. Her delicate features showed little emotion, and she basically never spoke or expressed an opinion. Even when she was asked to venture one, she would agree with whatever the prince had said. The way she acted like the prince's shadow made her a convenient target, and her rivals for Elliott's affections often attacked her for lacking flair and said she didn't deserve him. She was an unobtrusive accessory to the prince's radiant beauty, an attractive fiancée who stayed out of the way. With no sense of self, her most endearing quality was how she reservedly supported the prince. It was why he'd found her dull. Elliott had assumed that because she was that kind of woman, she wouldn't dare push back against his condemnation, which was why he'd done it in such a public venue. But now Elliott was perplexed. Who was this woman, doing as she pleased in this ridiculous place? 04. The Duke realizes the situation. Duke Ferguson received word that the prince had terminated his engagement to Rachel at a party attended by many of the young members of the court. The situation was unbelievable, and as the head of a ducal house, he was preparing to make an emergency visit to the palace. He had sent his retainers out to gather information to help him grasp the situation. As the Duke panicked, his men came back one after another with bad news. "Are you certain that the prince broke off his engagement with Rachel at tonight's party?" the Duke asked. "Yes, sir. We were able to confirm that with multiple sources. She was restrained in the middle of the hall as he announced the annulment." The Duke clutched his head. That fool of a prince, I'm sure he wanted to make a spectacle of it, but doesn't he realize that wasn't the place for it? This isn't a matter of who was in the wrong, it's common sense. The Duke had already concluded that the prince was ruined. If you viewed the situation logically, it was plain to see that the way he theatrically broke off their betrothal, completely disregarding proper manners and customs, would become a problem once the king stepped in to resolve things. Naturally, the Duke was upset that his daughter's engagement had been broken without a word to him about it first. But in all honesty, he had a bigger problem now. He slammed his hands down on his desk. That vacuous moron. He's gone and awakened the devil child. The Duke's eldest daughter, Rachel, had been pretty from a young age, and her reserved behavior and ephemeral appearance had led other houses to assume that she was an introverted and quiet beauty. Not knowing any better, the Duke and Duchess had been incredibly proud of her. They'd believed wholeheartedly that their daughter was wonderful. They couldn't have been more wrong. As their daughter grew and they gradually came to see who she was, the Duke and Duchess's smiles became more strained. She acted worse than the average bully. When a group of bullies chased her up a tree, she threw a beehive at them. Then, when an older boy came to back them up, she clobbered him with a rolling pin she'd been hiding. Once that was done, she pushed the ringleader into a pond for revenge. Hearing the ruckus, the Duke rushed to investigate, and he spotted her throwing rocks at the boy as he tried to get to shore. When he stopped her, she looked at him, and with a completely serious expression, said, "Don't worry. If I keep throwing rocks at him, he won't float to the surface for a while." It was at this moment that the Duke first thought there was a high probability that his beloved daughter was a psychopath. In order to dissuade her, the Duke pointed out the difficulty of piling rocks on top of an object underwater, and he explained how the resistance of the water as they sank and the irregular shape of the rocks would make it hard to determine their course. It was evident from this exchange that the Duke was panicking a bit. His daughter, eyes sparkling, exclaimed, "That's amazing, father." But in all honesty, this was the first time that her praise went in one ear and out the other. Once her parents realized how warped Rachel was, they put a touching amount of effort into making sure she developed a degree of sociability commensurate with her good looks by the time she was grown. The Duke felt that after he'd explained that manners and morals were like the rules of a game and that order existed so everyone had a fair chance to play, she grew into their ideal daughter. But the Duke and Duchess never forgot. If Rachel were to ever stop thinking that she had to follow the rules, they had no idea what their daughter might do. That was why they had focused so heavily on giving her the moral education necessary for a child of the nobility. Despite their every contingency, this termination of her engagement, they never saw it coming. The Duke knew better than anyone what had just happened. Prince Elliott, the damned fool, had just gone and upended the chessboard. As the Duke barked orders, driven by the you said to get ahead of this as soon as possible, a servant rushed into the room, out of breath. "We've received more details." Asterisk. "Has there been any movement?" the Duke asked. The retainer, blue in the face, began his report. The Duke, stressed to the max, listened intently. "I'll explain in detail." The young lady accepted His Highness's announcement without any change in expression, and she remained quiet as she was restrained and marched off to the dungeon. The Duke froze for a moment before slumping into his chair like he'd collapsed. The butler rushed to his side. The Duke stared absently into space for a while, then mumbled, "The prince. He's done for." The butler, who was well acquainted with Rachel's upbringing, nodded gravely and said, "Yes, sir." If Rachel had already decided to act, it was out of the Duke's hands. He had no choice but to let her do as she pleased and wait until she'd blown off some steam. No longer in a rush, the Duke sat in front of his desk and slowly put tobacco in his pipe. "I think I'll have a smoke," he told himself. "Yes, that's what I'll do, because there's nothing else I can do." The Duke was filled with a great many emotions as he took a puff and exhaled. Then he remembered something. Still, George must have been at the party. What is he doing now? George would have been close to the prince as one of his hangers-on. If he'd acted to mediate the issue or reported to the Duke before things developed to this point, this uproar could have been dealt with before it got out of hand. As the Duke let out an exhausted sigh, the servant who'd brought the reports hesitantly delivered a follow-up about George. "Well, you see, it seems the young master is as infatuated with the Baroness's daughter, who was at the center of this drama, as His Highness and the others. He was an active participant in their condemnation of her." The Duke and the butler looked at each other. "George is a dead man." "Yes, sir." How, after 16 years of living with his sister, could that imbecile not understand something so simple? George had to have seen that Rachel was running wild, so what was he thinking? If Rachel's anger toward her brother were to explode, the Duke had no intention of defending his son and heir. That could get him caught in the crossfire. The Duke valued his own hide far more than that of the idiot son who had ruined everything. As the Duke looked up at the ceiling and took a puff from his pipe, there was a ruckus in the hall, and his wife raced into the room. "Oh, Dan, is Syria?" The Duke hurried to his feet as his stumbling wife leapt into his arms. "It's Rachel. She's... I know. I was just listening to the reports. Try to be strong. The Duchess had completely lost her head, and she continued shouting with tears in her eyes. But darling, if she let them escort her away, then she plans to kill him. The future of our house and His Majesty's life are all about to shatter. It's going to be fun. Rachel is 17 now. She's not a child. She's old enough to make adult decisions. The Duke tried to console his sobbing wife with words he didn't believe. However, she took no comfort in them. Dan, you don't understand. When she was just a little girl, I caught her singing Lizzie Borden while gleefully swinging an axe. Calm yourself, Iseria. It's fine. It's going to be fine. Rachel has grown into a proper young lady in the last 10 years. These days, we don't have to worry about her bludgeoning His Highness to death with a blunt instrument. I'm sure she'll use hard-to-prosecute methods to destroy his psyche. Really? Is Rachel really going to be okay? She might well burn the capital to the ground to kill him. Believe in your daughter, Iseria. She is smart and well-educated. She'd never do something stupid that would take her down with him. I'm sure she'll employ methods that leave no trace to absolutely demolish him. What was his daughter thinking right now? Was he sure she wouldn't resort to a weapon? The Duke had no idea. He didn't even know how to resolve this situation. All he could do at this juncture was sigh. A number of servants had gathered around the two of them, but they'd all been with the family far too long to comment on the current situation. Pardon me. As the Duke was rubbing his wife's back comfortingly, a person with a voice so utterly calm it seemed out of place in this nervous excitement sought permission to enter the room. Looking to see who it was, the Duke found Rachel's personal maid and childhood friend, Sophia, bowing her head. Oh, Sophia, your timing is perfect. Have you heard about Rachel? Yes, of course. I will be heading to the government office to lodge an immediate complaint. You will be accompanying me, so get ready. You'll bring Rachel the things she'll need while she's in prison. If they refuse, use my name to make them let you through. Whatever else they were going to do, they needed to ensure that Rachel, who had been taken from the party straight to the dungeon, had a change of clothes and other necessities. He thought it would be fastest to have Sophia, who knew Rachel best, make the preparations. However, Sophia said, "No, that is already taken care of. You're already prepared? I should have expected no less from you." Yes, the preparations have been made, and her things have already been delivered. I see. You work fast, huh? Already delivered? When he looked at Sophia, who just nonchalantly said something he couldn't possibly ignore, the ashen-haired girl and the two other maids behind her nodded. The young mistress discovered in advance that her engagement was to end tonight. That is why, with her direction, we have already prepared the food and necessities that she will need for the next 3 months and delivered them to the dungeon. Unlike Rachel, who could show a surprising amount of expression in private, Sophia wore a steel mask. She delivered shocking facts as if she were merely relating common sense without so much as batting an eyelash. Huh? The Duke murmured. All sorts of doubts raced through his mind as he pressed a hand to his forehead. Hold on. She knew in advance? Why would Rachel deliberately refrain from preventing it? And I know it's only for one person, but how did you carry enough supplies to live on for 3 months into the castle? She was unsure if he would truly go through with it, Sophia explained. But when she learned of his plans to scrap the engagement, the young mistress said, "So you're telling me I can be rid of that idiot in a way that leaves him responsible for it, and I get a vacation? Splendid." Sophia's tone had clearly said, "Why ask something so obvious?" The Duke sighed. Rachel. Also, ever since her engagement to the prince was decided, we, the Black Cats of the Dark Knight, have been inserting ourselves in key positions at the palace. As long as we know in advance that an event like this is coming, our forces can easily sneak in supplies under the guise of their official duties. Rachel, what exactly are you trying to do? The Duke was relieved to learn that his daughter was in a more even state of mind than he'd feared, but at the same time, he shuddered with terror as he realized that his daughter's darkness ran deeper than he'd ever suspected. How was there an intelligence organization operating out of his house without his knowing? And how were they so ingrained in the palace that they had free rein to bring in carts full of supplies? That was more than what the spy networks of some nations could manage. If Rachel had taken it this far, it would be easy for her to assassinate one little prince, right? Thoughts like these raced through the Duke's head. He decided to give up on thinking. Anyway, I'll go to the government office and lodge that complaint, he said. Take care, Sophia called after him.